Good morning, and thank you very much for coming out on a sleepy Saturday to hear thoughts about religion and economics. Maybe the economics are more interesting. I'd also like to thank all the organizers of the conference, those who conceptualized it, and also those who did all of the day-to-day work to make it possible and to invite me here. Thank you very much. Looking at the double topic of religion and economics, especially as the first panel of the day, I thought I'd begin with a few of the suppositions about each alone and then the two together. So my prolegomena will be in particular about those suppositions that I believe are not helpful in discussing religion and economics, and then I'll discuss a few theological ideas that I think might be helpful to our economic future. In short, I'm going to start with what I don't want to talk about. The first supposition is that modern markets and economic growth are the major source of economic difficulties today. For me, this supposition is too broad. Features of market organization need some or substantial reworking, but modern markets, as even its early critics like Antonio Genovese recognized, provided opportunity for the not wealthy commoner to get out of inherited, unappealable poverty. This was the advantage that Adam Smith, too, saw in markets, not to create the Wolf of Wall Street, but to give ordinary people a way of economic development. Luigino Bruni, one of the staunchest critics of capitalism today, has written also, this was Smith's main point about capitalism. Smith argues that markets, while involving individual action, as my colleague will describe, are not meant to set individualist greed as the mores for all society. But rather, Smith argues that markets must be set amid the virtues and relations that guide market forces towards their positive uses. Each person should, and now I'm quoting Adam Smith, the supposed guru of greed, Smith writes, each person should endeavor as much as he can to put himself in the situation of the other and to bring home to himself every little circumstance of distress which can possibly occur to the sufferer. In short, Smith mandates the biblical golden rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Excuse me. I have to find a place for these. Here. Excellent. This requires education, Smith wrote. Honesty, promise-keeping, discipline, patience, cooperation are learned in families, communities, and religious organizations. And without them, Smith said, markets collapse into chaotic greed. As England's markets grew increasingly unregulated, Smith's critique sharpened. Capitalism, he wrote, makes workers dull, destroys community, vitiates morality, fosters anonymous cities, and allows the flamboyant rich to corrupt all. So my first supposition is that capitalist markets are not a priori evil, but that we should develop them as their originators in the 18th century understood them, set within the world as a relational and reciprocal place. My second supposition is that theology helps us to do this. And this means that, again, we have to look at the suppositions about religion that I don't want to talk about. That religion is irrational, univocal, absolutist, incompatible with critical thinking, intolerant, and leads to greedy, in-group, out-group thinking and violence. I will explain why I wish to remove these from discussion. First, univocity, incompatible with critical thinking and absolutism. On the theological account, as I understand it, multiplicity of persons and interpretations of world, including interpretations of sacred texts, not univocity or absolutism, but multiplicity is the nature of creation. Each of us is unique. This is the way whatever made the world made it. And so each of us interprets world a bit differently. As Joseph Soloveitchik, the German Jewish philosopher, wrote, "Pluralism is founded on reality itself. The world presents itself plurally. Each person's grasp of the world is partial and different. Only God has complete knowledge. To assert absolute knowledge is self-deification and idolatry, the most serious of biblical sins." Echoing Joseph Soloveitchik is the Protestant Glenn Stassen, who writes, "Nor am I arguing for only one tradition as having all truth. All traditions need continuous correction." And the Catholic Robert Doran adds, "Anyone engaging in direct theological discourse must always be engaged as well in continual ressourcement involving critique within faith communities and exchange with those outside it." Or as the words of that great theologian, General George Patton, "If everybody is thinking alike, somebody isn't thinking." Second supposition about theology is that the idea that theology is absolutist and intolerant is belied also by the history of religious toleration, which began as a religious argument in the 16th and 17th centuries from religious thinkers such as Sebastian Frank, Sebastian Castellio, both Reformed Protestants, Baruch Spinoza, Jewish, Robin Williams, Baptist, John Locke, Puritan, Socinian, William Penn, Quaker. Their argument, their religious argument, based on the plurality of human interpretations, was precisely that because each person and church, quote, is orthodox to itself, to others erroneous and heretical, as John Locke wrote, no person of partial knowledge, which is all we have, can judge another person. Only God can judge belief. It is also banal to recall the movements for peace, justice, and inclusion spearheaded by faith leaders such as Dorothy Day and the Latin American liberation theologians, Catholic, Martin Luther King Jr., Reformed Protestant, Desmond Tutu, Anglican, Emanuel Levinas, Martin Buber, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Jewish. The third supposition is that theology promotes in-group, out-group thinking, which is also belied by the faith leaders that I've just mentioned as they built on the core Abrahamic mandates: peace, help to the needy, and generosity to the stranger and to the enemy. Mandates to peace include the requirement to ask all enemies for peace before commencing any war, Deuteronomy 20:10, and the requirement to allow enemy residents of besieged cities to leave the cities unharmed. Requirements to aid the needy are many in the Bible, as you know, including feeding the poor and the stranger. Ezekiel grants strangers even land rights. Even more striking are the numerous mandates that strangers be incorporated into the economy so that they do not become poor to begin with. We may also look at the limits on indentured servitude and slavery, and the mandates that slaves in service be set free with generous provisions to start a new life. We can look also at the limits of taking interest from the poor. Deuteronomy 23:19 prohibits the taking of interest altogether, and there are roughly 2,000 other provisions regarding helping others, the stranger, the poor, and the needy, and the enemy. We might also number, of course, the hospital, schools, prison programs, etc., that have been run by people of faith. The fourth way about religion that I don't want to talk about is the related charge of exceptional religious violence, especially vivid here in the center of Europe's wars of religion. This should have been laid to rest by the secular horrors of the 20th century. But the colonialism, slavery, political oppression, and torture of the 19th or the 18th century will do as well. All the way back to antiquity, crucifixion, after all, was a tool of Roman politics, not religion. Even a short review of the war's subjugation, tribal, racial, and ethnic persecution for political and economic benefit should jettison the idea of a special religious predisposition to violence. Fifth, the charge that religions are irrational and thus evil I find odd on two counts. Irrationality is not per se evil, and religions are not per se irrational. The idea that irrationality is evil I find a bit alarming, as love, art, and generosity are all irrational. And yet I don't think we want to be rid of these on grounds of their irrationality. Moreover, religious tenets are not irrational. They are sometimes called so, misread, absent without the exegetical tools that enables us to understand them. We in the modern West educate ourselves about politics, economics, and science so that we may read about these topics discerningly, but we come to theology not with the Scottish Journal of Theology or Modern Theology or Proof Text or Okhimta, but with the approaches that we learned as children, and then we wonder why we find religion childlike. The point of theological tenets based in biblical narrative, symbolism, imagery, parable, is not historical or scientific facticity. Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, calls this, quote, rather the wrong end of the stick, close quote, as the purpose of studying sacred texts is not accuracy, but inquiry into the human condition, our making and responding to good and evil. In short, the Bible is a problem set, not IKEA instructions to be followed, a problem set to develop an understanding of the world and an ethics for living in it. Neither is this a modern idea. The Talmud, for example, takes biblical narratives as imagery to represent theological principles, and it prohibits their use as history and science. Of course, later rabbis prohibit the use of Talmudic science as science. Ibn Rushd, Averroes of the 12th century, insisted on a critical interpretation of texts, and as you know, so does the German historical critical method of biblical exegesis and all modern scholarship. What is obscured by these views of religion is that religions are human institutions capable of good and evil that other institutions are. For believers, God may be God, but religions are human, and so they must be looked at as other human endeavors are looked at. Politics may be good and bad, and when populations are brutalized by political systems, Nazism, Stalinism, apartheid, Maoism, etc., we don't propose that the solution lies in getting rid of politics per se. When economic systems yield the horrors in poverty and labor abuses, we don't solve this by ridding ourselves of all economics. It makes no more sense to speak of ridding ourselves of religious tenets and ideas, for then we lose all the wisdom as well. Here I'll end my prolegomena. This is not a system that's working. 1 minute. Maybe there's someplace down below. No. We got it. Thank you. Here I'll end my prolegomena on approaches that I wish to remove from discussion and suggest that economic ills today emerge not from too much religion, not from too much theology, but from not enough of it. In short, I suggest we need more of the following theology. First, we must understand that Protestantism did contribute to early capitalism. Weber, as you know, emphasized Protestantism's rationalization of life. But the importance of individual striving, to my mind, is also key. With the mandate for each person to strive towards moral conduct and towards God, with striving in such an important place, striving per se became a way of life, a frequent praised activity, and a well-exercised muscle, flexed precisely because it was praised in many of life's arenas. And with striving interwoven now into ethical behavior, its losses in negative economic outcomes, labor abuses, for instance, became harder to see. Yet Protestantism, a human institution, was not acting alone in the early modern era, but in synergy with science, economics, and politics. With the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries came substantial gain in humanity's control of nature, with the intended consequences of benefits to health and prosperity, and the unintended consequences of a worldview shift from humanity being in nature to being above nature, in control of it, and ever able to get more out of it. This scientific shift was accompanied by nominalism, a fascination with the mind's inner processes and the human mind's ability to run the world and change what things mean. For instance, to change unpredictable nature into a controllable tool. With this came an inflated sense of self-sufficiency and awe of the supposed internal mind that masters external world by mining, inventing, and manufacturing new stuff. Advances in living standards and the relief of much misery followed, but the forces that yielded the thrill of not dying so young and of linens and teacups yielded also the labor abuses, environmental damage, and vast inequalities of opportunity and wealth that we know. This is a feature of modernity. It is a synergistic interaction among science, economics, politics, and also, but not only, Protestantism. To address these problems, we do not suggest ridding ourselves of science, economics, and politics. It makes no more sense to get rid of religion. Striving itself is not harmful. Unproductive outcomes arrive when striving is uncoupled from an ontology of what we are striving for and an ethics of how to get it, precisely as the Abrahamic religions hold. Theologically, nominalism does not hold. The individual is not on her own to control, improve, and gain. Theologically, she is in an ontological system that mandates responsibility for others and our planet. It is this theology that I would now like to sketch. We may begin with the idea of the source of being, the reason there is something rather than nothing, and the reason for the specific things that are and the specific principles by which the world goes round. A structuring cause of unfolding possibilities for what is now and what may become. As it is the source of all being, all particular beings, including persons, partake of it in order to exist or in order to be at all. Yet each particular partakes of being differently. We are not identical. Not even identical twins are the same in character, aims, etc. Particular beings emerge from the source of being not as identical copies, but analogously. Thomas Aquinas's analogy of being, the analogia entis, holds that each of us expresses something of the source of being, as an analogy expresses its referent, with different features, but with an undergirding of a kindness. More poetically, we are tselem Elohim, imago Dei, in the image of God. In the image of God, analogously, not identically. In all things, Aquinas wrote, God himself is properly the cause of universal being, which is innermost in all things. In all things, God works intimately. Maimonides, Al-Farabi, Ibn Rushd came to similar understandings. What we partake of when we partake of the source of being is the principle of distinction amid relation. I will explain this. The source of being is at once radically different from material, bodily, finite beings as we are. But as we partake of being in order to be, the source of being inheres in us, so to speak. We are in this primary relation to being in order to be at all. We are distinct from source of being, but in this primary relation. And this distinction yet relation is the way anything comes to exist. Since it's the only way to exist, all of us are distinct, but in relation in our world. Each person is of the source of being. As a child, you might say, is of her parents, and could not come into being without them. Yet no one is identical to parents or to siblings who too are of the same parents. We are distinct, what Alain Badiou calls universal singularity. Yet each of us develops in relation, beginning with our earliest childhood caretakers, through increasingly layered and complex engagement with others, groups, sometimes near and sometimes across the globe. In this setup, Aquinas continues, the cause of causes sets up the basic principles, the laws of nature, for instance, and persons act secondarily, working with these basics as we humanly can in the world. The sun, for instance, makes the Earth's surface a certain way, which makes certain chemicals and their interactions, like hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and persons plant seeds and so secondarily cause grain to grow. The idea of humanity acting as secondary causes is found also in the Judaic principles of co-creatorship and Tselem Elohim, the image of God. Humanity partakes of God's being, his image, its image, her image, in analogous of a kindness. Humanity, analogously partaking of this divine source, works in this world with human capacities secondarily as co-creator to further God's vision in world. Indeed, the point is that we have the moral capacity to do so. We have the moral correspondence, the Dmut Elohim, or similitudo in Latin, to act in correspondence with the divine setup of distinction amid relation. We have the moral capacity to act with regard for each person's distinction, distinct value and worth, and simultaneously our interdependence or interrelation. Again, with regard for each person's distinct aims, needs, goals, and value, and with recognition of our primal interrelation. This is the divine ontology. It's the way things are. We are creatures of reciprocal development and impact. It is, in some sense, the ontology without modernity's strong nominalism, and with analogy and differentiation instead. Ontology with strong nominalism looks like this. We live in a setup, a cosmic ordering, whose rules are learnable and knowable by me as the scientific subject in control of its object. That's the nominalist move. And this may lead to absolutism, I know the one truth, and possibly intolerance and violence. Now let us consider our ontology without modernity's strong nominalism, but with analogy and differentiation instead. It goes like this. We live in a setup, a cosmic ordering, whose rules are learnable and knowable by humanity. But as we are non-identical, analogous expression of the source of being, each of us is differentiated from one another. Each experiences the world a bit differently, and so has different explanations or interpretations of the world, including interpretation of sacred texts. As our interpretations are different, it is the accumulation and interactions and debates and discussions and disagreements and self-corrections that occur within our various forms of knowledge as they interact with each other. And this process moves us slowly, non-linearly, towards understanding how things are. In other words, our knowledge, too, is distinction amid relation. Each has her understanding of the way things are. But this understanding develops and self-corrects in relation to other understandings. Karl Rahner, the Catholic German theologian, calls this unity in difference. James Orpheus calls it non-oppositional difference. Catherine Keller and Laurel Schneider, entangled differences. Given our relational ontology, we need to see to our relational networks and to the educational, familial, socioeconomic, and political institutions that enable persons to become who they distinctly are. In practice, the ethics that emerges from our relational ontology is reciprocal consideration worthiness. This is not a formula, but a process of taking the concerns of the distinct other to be as worthy of consideration as one's own are, to be accounted for as one's own are to be counted. Reciprocal consideration worthiness brings out two things: common needs, goals, interests, and differences. Differences, if we are to engage one another from a position other than blank separatedness, needs to be approached. Differences need to be approached in Joel Hunter's wonderful words. We must begin by asking why the other side is for the other side, even if that is difficult to articulate, so that the answers to that question may be broken into practices and policies. This might begin by near others, families, communities, neighborhoods, but given the present mobility of persons, goods, microbes, and ideas, areas of interdependent impact reach across the globe, and anyway, the globe is affecting the neighborhood. In short, the theology of relationality, theology of the way things are, yields an ethics of how not to mess things up. Distinction amid relation and the process of reciprocal consideration worthiness would affect and offer an undergirding normative source of meaning by which present practice and policy can be assessed and new ones proposed. In an example, the question might not be whether a timber firm and its employees, who want to retain their jobs, may legally to continue logging trees against the protests of the local community and environmental protection groups. That's not the question. The question might be to recognize that loggers, shareholders, management, too have interests in forests surviving to the next generation of building materials, jobs, and profits. Thus, what would the outcome look like if all involved, owners, management, shareholders, employees, town residents, environmental protection groups, believe in the way we believe we breathe? That discussions begins with finding out why the other side is for the other side. And then discussions continue by taking that as consideration worthy. No one leaves the discussion until all have contributed substantially to the solution, and until an idea is developed where no one's concerns are abandoned. Let us assume that this is simply what people think is done. It wouldn't occur to anybody to do anything else. That's a different ontology. It may seem that getting there from where we are here is not easy, but in fact we already know how to do this. And my colleague, Mr. Felber, was going to explain more about that later. The socio-economic and political ideas have been proposed to include basic goods such as health, security, association, respect, and personal development. Other economic ideas have pointed to the means and the actual capacity for achieving these goals, civil rights and education, for instance, health. Pragmatic suggestions, as you know, have been discussed at various high-level meetings for decades among the G7 and the G20 and the United Nations and the European Union, etc. But we have had disappointing results. It's not that the economic ideas are lacking, but that the ontology is, in what the Catholic theologian Bernhard Lonergan calls a flight from insight. We have the insight, we flee from it. This is among the ideas that theologians are talking about, and this is what we must take much more seriously. Those who argue that we can come to reciprocal consideration, worthiness, and relationality from a secular humanist principle, that we need not rely on theological discourse, must account for their principles. Where did they come from? What reasoning sustains them? And what explains what they mean today, not only as roots, as history, what explains what they mean today and how they work? When the critics of Jacques Derrida noted that his philosophy of indeterminacy and deconstruction devolved into relativism, all standards and all conduct being equal, he replied that no, his philosophy does not devolve into relativism because people in situ, in the real world, do not engage in endless indeterminacy, but rather they have values. They get their values from, quote, where they are. I agree. People do get values from where they are. But how did where they are get where it is? Not only where do secular values come from, but where do frameworks that explain and illuminate how they work today? I have learned about those frameworks most rigorously from the theologies that I have sketched, from distinction amid relation, as expressed in Tselem Elohim Imago Dei, covenant, moral correspondence, or Dmut Elohim Similitudo, the Analogia Entis, the relationality of Trinity and Eucharist.
Well, that's going to be a difficult act to follow, I think. What a fantastic and incisive talk that was. And if you ever find yourself behind one of these lecterns, you'll know that the thing you worry about most is the papers. So seeing Marcia fumble around, I've been sitting here worrying about this and that for the last 20 minutes. I think I might just sit and do some jokes for a few, you know, we can all come around. I'd like to start again by echoing Marcia and saying what a pleasure it is to be here, to thank the organizers, the curators, everyone whose ideas have been put into place here, and I hope it turns out to be a really exciting and interesting couple of days. It certainly looks as if it should be. And I also have to apologize that to my absolute shame, I speak almost no German at all. As a result, I did have the opportunity as a schoolboy, but as a result of idleness, I think, and yes, not much else, this entire session is having to be conducted in English. So thank you very much for indulging me in that one, and my heartfelt apologies. So, following on from Marcia's talk, I'm going to agree with a lot of the things that she has said, but I'm not, despite any pretenses, a philosopher. I'm a student of organizations, a management researcher. I'm interested in the way that we organize and the way that that changes the world around us. So in a sense, it kind of, speaks to the question of how do we get where we are? How do these values come to be? Very often, they're embedded in organizational structures and organizational markets. And that's what I'll talk about for the next half hour or so. But anyway, I haven't always been. I've forgotten to put the clock on as well. I'm sorry, I'll just do that quickly. I haven't always been a management researcher. Many years ago, when I was a master's student, I studied medieval Arabic thought. And I had, as part of this, the good fortune, you might say, to edit and translate 2 chapters of an ancient Arabic manuscript. And this was written by an Alexandrian physician whose name was Abdul-Latif al-Baghdadi. And it was a gloss on a work of an earlier Greek commentator who himself had been paraphrasing Aristotle. And this manuscript had been stored in the library of a Turkish monastery for hundreds of years, copied many times by hand, was dotted with little specks of fly poo, which, as you can imagine, is something of a problem on an Arabic manuscript, if you've got any sense at all of how the language works, all those little dots. So this was enough to make a young student's eyes water, and I decided after a while to change my studies in another direction. But this manuscript was all about providence, or tadbir in the Arabic. And since mankind's earliest intellectual adventures, we've sought some sort of reassurance that the world is ordered by something other than ourselves. The ancients, starting with Aristotle, thought that the world was at the center of the universe and imagined a set of celestial spheres sliding one over the other, ever less changeable and more perfect. So they moved away from the chaos of the world around us, this disorder, until eventually they reached the untouchable realm of the heavens, the perfect realm of the divine soul. And according to Abdul-Latif in this manuscript, providence was a sort of divine power that emanated, seeped in from this outside world, and became ever more diffuse as it got down to earth. But it organized earth. So things live and breathe, they talk, they think, they walk, they grow on account of the differing measures of the divine soul that they have in them. It's this kind of fundamental animating force of human nature. So I'd like to say that things have moved on a bit since then. But when I read Hayek, for example, who suggests that the natural order of crystalline structures in nature is a model of the organizational structures, or a model for, we should say, the organizational structures of the free market economy, I really wonder if we've just swapped one set of beliefs for another. We still seem to need this faith, this reassurance of divine order, and to be able to place our faith in something beyond our everyday experience. So it seems, for the last 3 or 4 decades at least, that faith seems to have centered on markets and on economics, a very particular kind of economics, I should say. So, anyway, it's the consequences of that faith, in terms of our humanity, our personhood, if you like, that I would like to talk about today. And I want to talk about growth. The session is about growth. So growth is what we mean: expansion, proliferation, there being more of something today than there was yesterday. And I don't want to get sort of smart with you and try and reposition growth as a spiritual thing. I just say let's talk about increase and proliferation. But I do want to suggest that growth can be pointed in different directions and have different consequences. So perhaps over the next few minutes, I can sketch out a vision of growth that offers more possibilities for humanity. And I thought about, well, I've titled this talk for myself, Rethinking Growth, but actually I wonder if it would be better titled Reorganizing Growth. Because again, I'd like to stress that these particular forms of organization, or particular ideas, emerge from organization, and that virtue and stewardship, if those are the kind of things that we're trying to achieve, are embedded in organizational structures, and perhaps even markets. So that's where I'll be heading. So anyway, let's get back to faith, and once again back to providence. And the notion of providence is more closely entwined with modern economic ideas than you might think. So you'll all know, of course, that Adam Smith, philosopher, man of letters, economist, pillar of the 18th century Enlightenment, breathed life into this idea of self-interest as a motivating force in society. So in 1776, when he published The Wealth of Nations, he told us it was the self-interest of the baker, the brewer, and the butcher that would provide our supper, not their innate kindness or charity. Although, as you may also have seen recently, the feminist author Catherine Marsal has pointed out that who cooked Adam Smith's dinner, she asked. Well, of course, his mum did. He lived at home and was fed and watered by his mother's charity all his days. So, you know, that kind of queers the pitch from the outset. And Smith argued that mankind had a propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, and that he was distinguished from the beasts not by the gift of stewardship over the earth, but nor through being made in God's image, but through this ability to exchange. So this is an incredibly influential understanding of people, and it's been incredibly persuasive. Smith says, trade makes us what we are, and if you need something from someone, you had better rely upon their base self-interest, because that's the only thing you can trust. And it's true, he also spent a lot of time worrying, and particularly in the theory of moral sentiment. So I don't want to debase Smith's ideas, but this is his central notion of the organizing properties of society. And how does he get there? Well, the Enlightenment, of course, sought to do away with the dead hand of religion, you know, this incredible time of progress, looking forward to a better society with a sense of science and possibility and all the things that could offer. And in the Enlightenment, nature took the, if we always have to have a sense, part of the role of a religious worldview is to organize how we understand the world and our place in it. And one of the things that happened in the Enlightenment was that nature took that place from the divine. So that Smith believed that nature, if left to its own devices, would channel economic activity in the most beneficial manner. So we have this famous line, by directing that industry, he wrote, in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, the businessman intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. So, in the 1980s, of course, Smith's name regained prominence as the champion of free market, the classical economist who first pointed out this invisible hand. And the invisible hand, as you'll know, became the best, if not the only, justification for ideas like the trickle-down effect, the idea that a healthy market will, left to its own devices, self-regulate and turn competing self-interest into wealth for all. But I think these free market evangelists of the 20th century took Smith's name in vain, because he's not advocating untrammeled self-interest. He is instead making a kind of theological point about the immanence of divine intention, or natural intention, or divine intention in nature, I should say, and therefore natural intention and order in the market. And I don't think he's really saying that you can only trust the baker's most base instincts. He's saying, what a wonderful world we inhabit, where even these basest instincts, even these lowest instincts, can produce such virtuous outcomes as our supper. And so for these Enlightenment thinkers like Smith, it's nature, not scripture, that offers mankind the comprehension of the divine. And the laws of heaven are written into the laws of nature, and thus into the wonderful, ineffable operations of the market. So, Smith, and even more particularly those little Smithians of the 20th century who follow after him, believe that a particular kind of human relationship is central to well-being and progress. Not one of kindness or generosity, nor one of altruism or imagination, but one based upon self-interest and competition. Private vice, they say, leads to public virtue. Self-interest provides the motivation for any action, and competition the disciplinary mechanism. So by this way of thinking, the more interactions are colonized by economic exchange and given over to self-interest, the better. And in a really famous example of this kind of thinking, in 1956, the British economist, I'm afraid to say, British economist Dennis Robertson asked the question, what does the economist economize? And he answered, the economist economizes on love. He says, love is a scarce resource, And if we rely upon love, by which I think he means kind of civic virtue or altruism or anything like that, if we rely upon love to organize society, then when we'll use it all up. And when we really need it, there won't be any left. So I'll leave that slightly peculiar argument for the moment, pick it up near the end of the talk. But at the moment, I just want to say that growth doesn't just involve the growth of wealth, the growth of all the wonderful things that Marcia talked about, but also it involves a proliferation of ways of doing things and ways of interacting with people. And particularly, if we believe in the market as an organizing principle for human relations, then it means a growth in market-style human relations, which are a very particular kind of thing. And therefore, growth becomes intimately linked with a much more, to my view, important question, which is how best should we organize society? So, in parallel with this little history of our faith in markets and economy, it's possible to tell another history, which is a history of growth and proliferation of commodities, a history of wealth and accumulation. And that history would chart the move from village-based craft production of goods through the growth of trade in the Middle Ages to the coming of industrialization and the birth of the manufactured commodity. And in the present day, it would need to deal with the new frontier of production and accumulation that is the digital world. Now, of course, wealth has always been associated with status and accumulation. I reread Homer's Iliad a couple of years ago, and I was really struck this time round by the importance that the circulation of artifacts plays in the story, and this obsessive, sort of almost fetishistic detail with which the poet describes all the different goods, swords and shields and helmets and tripods and cooking vessels and armor and chariots and plates and all of these kind of things. And you know, there's a central kind of narrative in the book is how much stuff is Agamemnon going to pay Achilles, isn't it, who is sulking down by the ships and has to be bought off for some slight or other. What's he going to get? You know, so there's this extraordinary fixation with goods as the source of wealth and power. And in medieval times, most wealth, in fact, was in the shape of weaponry and land. So if you've got weapons and land, then you have power and wealth. All of these kind of things are interlinked from a very, very early stage. But then, of course, as trade bloomed, a growing merchant class used precious goods, buildings, cloth, arts, spices, sugar, all sorts of things, to demonstrate their status and equality with the landowners. And then, later still, during the Industrial Revolution, commodities became mass market. So everybody could have a piece, and material status were no longer or material status symbols were no longer the preserve of the wealthy elite. In the 20th century, particularly after the Second World War, saw the rise of consumer culture, a boom in production and consumption driven primarily by technical advances and petrochemical exploitation. And with it, a great democratization of wealth, the proliferation of things, a social contract that dreamed of equal economic participation, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the final triumph of free market capitalism and these very bold claims of the end of history. But in fact, it wasn't the end of history. It wasn't even the end of history for this kind of growth and accumulation, because then we have the arrival of digital technology and the internet. And these things, social media too, have opened up incredible new possibilities for the production of commodities and the accumulation of wealth. While the early internet evangelists argued that digital technology would cut out the middleman, would put producers directly in touch with consumers, in fact, we seem worse off than before. So we have these huge monopolistic gatekeepers. We have giant taxi firms that don't actually run any taxis. We have giant bed and breakfast or hotel providers that don't own a single room. And each one of these is worth millions and millions of dollars. And with those commodities come new forms of labor, unpaid and invisible. So when I talk about this in class, I ask the students how many hours each week they spend on Facebook or YouTube, and it's a lot, a great deal. Then I ask them, who's getting rich? And it's certainly not the students. So they must be doing all the work, you know, creating, organizing, and consuming the content. And the digital frontier has become a wild west of wealth, ready to be grabbed. But instead of gold, there's personal data and the unpaid labor of particularly children, students, and the unemployed, those people with time available to spend laboring online. So it's ironic then that such new forms of work are tagged as liberating, aspirational, and entrepreneurial. And despite hopes that the internet would lead to community sharing and even new kinds of civic virtue, defined in terms of getting a job, that is in tangible monetary terms, all these notions of community and civic virtue have been chased away. And the borrowing that goes on from other programmers in order to make a successful mod is less an act of communal sharing than the one of snatch and grab. And in fact, I'm doing a similar kind of thing right now, because this example is one I've taken from the sociologist Detlev Svick, now based in Canada, but originally trained here in Cologne. So growth doesn't just mean the accumulation of wealth. It also means an expansion of doing and valuing according to the rules of the market. Growth, thus understood, may leave us financially rich, but impoverished in other so many less tangible ways. All of this, of course, is the Enlightenment dream of a sort being put into practice, an ever-increasing proliferation of commodities, even more expansive frontiers of growth and accumulation, and ever more human relationships being turned over to instrumental trading exchanges driven by self-interest and policed by the providential mechanism of competition. The final commodity, of course, is our own selves. Let me give you another example, one that exemplifies everything I've been talking about: the entrepreneurial capture of yet another area of our social life, the commoditization of persons as a tradable product, and the subsequent replacement of a pre-existing pattern of social relationship with ways of doing and valuing demanded by the market. And I'm talking, in case you haven't guessed, about online dating. So, since the birth of the internet, online dating has emerged as a serious commercial force and a huge social phenomenon. Global online dating firms turn over hundreds of millions of euros every year. And they promise, well, what do they promise? Some promise scientific methods which can help you find your partner for life. Others promise to help you find someone who's right for you, who shares interests, someone with whom you can enjoy your hobbies and activities. Still others promise to find you a woman or man in uniform, or somebody who went to the same university as you, or someone who reads the same newspaper. Whatever you fancy, really. And that's the point. It's re-engineering love as a consumer choice that makes it something that can be parceled up and sold. Love, which I would argue is so central to our happiness, our self-knowledge, and even our faith, is reduced thereby to the status of a tradable and exchangeable commodity. But how? How exactly does that happen? The devil is in the detail. This is my interest as an organizational researcher, you see. As is so often the case, human relationships can be turned on their head by a little bit of machinery, by a few measures and a few incentives. So, for example, many online dating sites allow people to search for potential partners using a mechanism that will be familiar to anyone who's ever used the internet to search for a second-hand car or a house. And these kind of interfaces offer a detailed menu of choices. I'm just picking one kind of the many different types of interface available. It's a very interesting example. They offer a detailed menu of choices, and users can select partner attributes such as age, height, type of figure, hair length, hair color, interests, marital status, ethnic origin, religion, education, children, where you stand on drinking and smoking. And it's not my prejudices listing those in order, listing hair length and color before education and religion. That's how they appear on the screen, and I suspect, well, not an indication of their perceived importance, it is a genuine indication of their importance in terms of the searching and ranking process that's offered by the site. And at the top of the screen, a counter lists the availability of matches. It's just like the used car site, Auto Trader, that we have in the UK. And as you become increasingly specific in your wants and desires, then the counter of availability tumbles down until eventually you have to start making trade-offs between availability and your various preferences. I made this remark to an audience with some economists a couple of years ago, and one of them said, oh, well, you're just maximizing your dynamic preferences, which is exactly right. But we don't do that in other kinds of life. So that's exactly what you have to do when presented with such an interface. You can't do anything apart from trying to maximize your returns in seeking a potential partner. And we also get a very nuanced idea of our own value in this particular exchange. So by virtue of a little electronic interface, a kind of market economic behavior has been brought into being. And the user becomes, in combination with the databases and the architectures of the dating website, a kind of cyborg economic agent, a cyborg data. And the problem there, of course, is that economic man, as we know, is selfish, instrumental, and even at times strategically dishonest. So, if we want evidence that online dating changes the way people go looking for love, would we expect to see those things? Well, plenty has been provided by researchers in psychology. We know, for example, that individuals go armed with a shopping list of perfect partner characteristics to be ticked off. We know that people are prone to petty dishonesties in their self-descriptions. They get a little bit taller and a little bit thinner. And we know that skimming through endless profiles fosters the illusion of choice and lowers commitment. So we hear plenty of stories about selfish men, and I'm afraid, guys, it nearly is always us. It's always selfish men that you hear in these stories. But the evidence is that the online systems bring out the worst in the people who use them. And the system isn't even fair, not at least in the sense of equal opportunity for all who uses. One of the reasons that is that we're not terribly good at identifying who's attractive to us in person via a profile. But we are quite good in identifying kind of generic traits of attractiveness in a picture. And what this means is that those who are perceived to be attractive become popular, the algorithms pick them up, and all the attention on the site is directed and sucked towards them. One of my friends back home admitted to me when we'd had a few, she said, you know, the reason I know online dating isn't working is because in real life it's not true that nobody fancies me, which I thought was from the heart, but very telling. So, online dating repositions love. It demands that we treat falling in love as a moment of active and rational choice where personal attributes and compatibility form the basis of attraction. I do understand. I mean, I'm not having a gripe about why people use these sites. And I must stress, before anyone brings it up in the questions, I'm genuinely happy for anyone who has built a long and loving relationship from the flimsy start that the match offers. But the point that I'm trying to make is a much more general one. While flourishing human relationships are mutually rewarding ongoing endeavors, relationships organized by market exchange are instrumental, self-interested, and solipsistic, and thereby, at least in my view, inferior. And you can put that even more simply. Does the good life involve getting more and more of what you want, or is it achieved in relationship with others? Or even, as the Christian tradition might put it, in service and devotion to God. So once again, back to faith. Excuse me. Faith offers a means of placing oneself in the world. In contemporary politics, we can see more than just the pursuit of growth and accumulation. There's a quasi-religious belief in the ordering power of markets, in the justice of economic action, and in the ability of the system to distribute wealth where it's most deserved. You can follow, as I've done in this talk, the parallel development of ideas about the spontaneous organization of markets and the accumulation of commodities of wealth. Markets are the mirror of nature, and therefore of God. From the delicate balance of the world, we can deduce the moral righteousness of economic growth. But it doesn't look that way. It doesn't look as if the current arrangements are sustainable, either in terms of the planet's capacity to support unlimited growth and production, or in terms of generational and geographic equity. When those of us who find ourselves comfortably off do so at the expense of younger, future, or foreign others. And it seems that that blind faith in the providential ordering of growth is as fanciful as Abdul Latif's long dissertation on the heavenly spheres. A little while ago, I mentioned the economist Dennis Robertson, who claimed that we must economize on love in case we run out of it when it's really needed. Michael Sandel, the Harvard philosopher, has an answer for that. Love or altruism is a habit that flourishes with practice. A little altruism, carefully applied, should lead to a little more, a virtuous circle of benign, non-instrumental social relations. But how to kickstart such a virtuous circle? I'd like to encourage everyone to think nice thoughts and suddenly become altruistic, but I suspect, again as a management researcher, I suspect we might need a little help. And my thoughts as someone who researches organization naturally turn in that direction. We can certainly organize for misery, so surely we can organize for happiness and fulfillment too. Markets are not in and of themselves bad things. So the challenge is this: can we build markets or other such economic structures that deliver riches to the soul or to the community rather than to the pockets of a few? Can we occupy economics? Can we repurpose growth? A sociologist at the London School of Economics named Juan Pablo Pardo Guerra, a fellow student of markets, has been struck by the radical program of synthetic biology, which aims to produce toolkits and building blocks that will allow anyone to build novel biological structures. And he wonders if the same rules could be applied to markets. So imagining markets based on and coupled to biological systems could result in markets that are, in his words, pragmatic, even civic. And he envisages a hacker paradise of self-contained, made-to-measure markets able to tackle specific problems and bring about certain ends. He suggests the conservation of the rhino as an example. Would it be possible, he wonders, to construct a market that wraps up and destroys the trade, one that changes social norms as it does so that it strangles itself on its own success? Let me offer an example of an economic form that does, I believe, just what Pardo Guerra intends. It doesn't solve the problem of the rhino horn, but it does confront another problem, one closer to home, the contemporary town. A place where no one knows anyone else, where some leave for work early and return late, where others remain isolated at home, perhaps old or infirm or unemployed and marginalized. A town whose residents are disenchanted and alienated, and where relationships have been permeated by this instrumental selfish behavior and casual competition. Would it be possible to imagine a market capable of rejuvenating a social space like this? Since the 1970s, some radicals have thought that it is, and their proposal comes in the shape of the local exchange trading scheme. I'll talk you through this quickly. The principle's simple enough. Members advertise services, skills, or produce they can offer, and others that they would like to receive. And usually there's some kind of directory, and members contact each other to request whatever it is they want. They agree a price in the scheme's notional currency, and the transaction is recorded by means of a check or an online system. All of which sounds very economic with its talk of bargains and accounting and checks, and I think that's exactly the point, as these schemes are an attempt to subvert and repurpose existing market arrangements. The big difference, though, comes in the agreement of the price, and this is based around the amount of time it takes to provide a good or a service. 3 hours of one service costs the same as 3 hours of another, irrespective of the nature of the service or who provides it. This equivalence of value and time is a fundamental principle or foundational principle of any such scheme. Organizers understand that there's something fundamentally liberating about pricing everybody's time at the same level. The unemployed, economically excluded individual is valued the same as the wealthy professional, no matter what service or product is offered. By participating in one of these trading scheme transactions, each individual actively recognizes the value of the other in a communal exchange. Now, skeptical observers will point out that the success of these trading schemes is mixed, and that's true. Even the successful ones seem to collapse under the weight of the bureaucracy required to manage them. The experience of those participants I've spoken to is that such schemes eventually peter out. But does this mean they're worthless? I don't think that it does. Local exchange trading schemes offer a window, just a little one, onto a new way of organizing markets, one that highlights the role of trust and empathy in economic exchange, and makes it possible to imagine that economics could be different, that it could be an economics for us, locally organized and productive, and one which we control in a local, very specific way. And it may even be that a local trading scheme is exactly the kind of hacker paradise market that Pardo Guerra envisages, self-contained and for purpose, and that any trading scheme is a necessarily short-lived thing with the seeds of its own demise sown in its success. For once the scheme has succeeded in establishing trading relationships among people who were previously strangers, the bureaucracy is no longer needed and the scheme wastes away. It leaves in its place a community. I've argued that the growth of market-like ways of doing and thinking, which has accompanied the economic growth of the last 30 years, corrodes our interactions and somehow robs us of our capacities as humans. But markets are here to stay. So perhaps what we need is not less markets, but better markets, not less growth, but better growth. Now, I don't imagine for a moment that a few well-meaning people swapping homemade jam for lawn mowing or cat-sitting for elementary Mandarin lessons constitutes a prescription for the overflow of global capitalism. But in an age where the possibilities of growth seem to have been captured by so very few, I do think that such novel forms of organization may offer us a way forward. Wouldn't it be wonderful to imagine specialized markets that could build communities, work for...
Can we occupy economics? Can we rethink economics? Sure we can. Can we repurpose growth? Of course we can. Can we design markets differently than they are, than we have designed them today? Maybe more intelligently? Of course we can. It depends if we want to do so, if we want to use our intelligence, creativity, humanity. Both speakers stated that markets are not evil by themselves a priori. It depends on how we design markets. Now we have managed to design globally capitalistic markets, allowing hostile takeovers, cannibalism, greed without any limit, vulture funds, and dumping in all its disciplines. But this is not necessary. This is absolutely random, and we could design humane, ethical markets that are based on human virtues. Everything depends on the rules. This is what Nobel, you know, there is no Nobel Prize for economics. There is something very similar, but Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom showed that you can manage a common, for instance, in a manner that it does not work. If you allow greed, if you allow breaking the rules, then it will fail. But if you make good rules by all of the participants and provide for the fulfillment of the rules, then commons work very well. And commons can be based on human values and virtues. It also depends on the goal. If the goal of market participants is the maximization of financial profits, then markets will not provide the results we want them to provide. And if we base markets on competition, then markets will not provide the results we want them to provide. Competition is a brilliant example for what Thomas Sedlacek told us yesterday. Economists believe deeply that competition motivates people and persons stronger than anything else. But they don't give us scientific proof for that. It's only and exclusively a belief. Hayek, another Nobel Prize winner, said competition is in most fields the most efficient method we know. And it does not quote one single study to prove it, although there are more than 500 empirical studies from other disciplines than economics, from social psychology, pedagogical science, game theory, neurobiology, and almost 90% of the studies that come to the result that competition is not the most efficient method we know in the meaning of motivating people and pushing human beings to high achievements. The result is that cooperation is better doing so, because cooperation motivates people differently and motivates people through flourishing relationships, first and foremost, whereas competition also motivates us, but differently, first and foremost by fear. And fear, in some situations in human life, may be very functional and necessary. But for the economy, we work a lifetime. And being our motivation based on fear, I think this is not an intelligent design of markets. So the economy for the common good, which we have developed over the last 5 years, proposes to exchange the market drivers for profit orientation and competition by other two, by striving for the common good, contributing to the common good, and cooperation, in the meaning of enhancing cooperation of free enterprises, of free markets. The concrete proposal is to disincentivate strongly the most aggressive patterns of counter-operation, to disincentivate lightly less aggressive patterns of counter-operation, to incentivize positively individual types of cooperation, and to incentivize strongly systemic strategies of cooperation. This is nothing new. If we look at constitution, at least in those countries that have one, and ask about the goal of the economy, we find that already today it's the common good. The whole economic activity serves the common good, tells us, for instance, the Bavarian Constitution. Now, Bavaria is not a national state, but also the German fundamental law tells us in Article 14 that property obliges. A company is a property, a private company is a property, a public company is also property, and this property obliges, quoting the fundamental law, in its use we always shall also provide the common good. And now I'm asking, how do we guarantee this? How do we measure it? How do we assure it? Adam Smith was betting on the invisible hand to transform individual self-interest into the common good. I think what is missing is a visible hand. And the visible hand might, for instance, be a common good balance sheet for a property, for a company that measures to which degree a company or an investor contributes to the common good. I would rephrase Adam Smith slightly different, using or betting on private virtues for public benefit. Why not? If we can, with intelligent rules, enhance and reward cooperation, solidarity, reciprocity, sustainability, empathy, tolerance, and democracy, why shouldn't we reward these behaviors instead of allowing cannibalism, vulturing, dumping, and other types of cooperation? They are all legal. And as long as they're legal, that's we learned from game theory and from Elinor Ostrom, then they will be implemented and they will overcome human virtues on the markets, and we will have unethical markets. Growth is not an end in itself. Growth, and the type of growth we're talking about, economic growth measured in financial terms, in monetary terms, GDP growth, is not an end in itself. There is no single constitution in the world which says that the overall goal, the overarching goal of the economy shall be the growth of GDP, although every single political program states it. But that's precisely counter-constitutional, because you won't find any single constitution that gives us this goal. You will find many constitutions, even the US Constitution, that talks about the general welfare and not about growth as an end in itself. Growth might be a means to achieve the goal, but by no means growth shall be the goal. That's why rethinkers of the economy are developing alternatives to the GDP as the overarching measurement of welfare and well-being. The OECD has developed the Better Life Index. So the good life, or even a better life, is considered the goal of the economy. The London-based alternative think tank New Economics Foundation has developed the Happy Planet Index. Maybe a happy planet is the goal of the economy in their view. And you know that in Bhutan, the tiny state, they are measuring the gross national happiness. Again, what are they doing? They are asking thousands of households every 2 years about all aspects of life quality, from individual well-being to participation in politics. Our proposal is to ask the free and sovereign citizens in all municipalities, communities, and districts what they regard as the 10 or 20 most relevant ingredients of life quality or common good, and compose with these ingredients the local common good indices, and later on the common good product, which is the democratically established success measurement for a national economy. Then nobody will care about GDP growth, because it's just irrelevant. If GDP grows, we do not know if the number of wars is increasing or declining. We do not know if we live in democracy or dictatorship. We do not know if the ecosystems become healthier or less healthy. We do not know if inequality is rising or shrinking. We do not know anything about any fundamental value, about the satisfaction of any basic need, or about the achievement of any common goal of a democratic society. So GDP in the future will only be irrelevant to economists. And my last comment is on Marcia Pally's invitation to try to understand all others who have a different opinion than us, to integrate their perspective in our opinion building. There has been, and I loved your concept of universal singularity. I came to the same result with the same worldview, or you could call it picture of us humans, or imago Dei, that every one of us is singular. And the logical consequence is that every single person necessarily has a different opinion from all others. And this is not a problem at all. This is a grace. I fully agree with it. So the challenge is to learn to communicate respectfully first, and second, to decide efficiently, having all of us a different opinion. And there is a mechanism which 2 scientists of University of Graz developed. It's called systemic consensus, and I would call it 360-degree consensus, because everybody is invited to bring in her or his perspective and proposal to resolve a problem that we have defined as a problem. And I give a last and hopefully understandable example. Now our elites are pushing through the TTIP, a free trade agreement between the US and the European Union. And if you criticize this, they ask, but there is nothing bad about trade. And no one ever said that there is something bad about trade. And then they say, well, shall we be like North Korea? And now, this of course is not an intelligent debate. So the 360-degree consensus decision-making process would work in the following manner. They can propose we make free trade without condition, but then at the cost of human rights, at the cost of labor standards, at the cost of social security, at the cost of sustainable development, cultural diversity, and gender equality. Somebody can, for sure, propose, let's make it like North Korea. Trade is something evil. Can be another proposal, no problem. And then a third party, like for instance the Movement for the Economy for the Common Good, can say, let's make ethical trade. And trade is not bad, it's not an end in itself, it's a means for the higher political goal, which are sustainable development, full respect of human rights and labor rights, social security, cultural diversity, and gender equality. And if trade helps to achieve these goals, then it's warmly welcome. As long as it endangers these goals, we will do less trade. This is a third position. And now the votation. And the free and sovereign citizens in a true democracy could be allowed to vote on these 3 proposals. Trade is an end in itself, free trade, no trade because trade is evil, or trade as a means, but with higher goals that regulate trade accordingly. And the result would be anchored in the Constitution or the base for the international trade.
Thanks. Maybe. Yes, this is for you. Yes, welcome. Also, I have the pleasure to moderate the discussion today. Thank you for these profound, inspiring, and surprising to me presentations. It's certainly not an easy task to bring these 3 perspectives together, but I think there's a possibility. I'll tell you what I understood. All the 3 of you have a concept of what it is to be a human being. And as a philosopher, I applaud that idea. I also remain skeptic when someone tells me that is the nature of the human being. But religion is in the business of doing so. Now, once you have that conception of what is a human being, you have a way of making a proposal to structure human relationships, politically, and the community, and also concerning markets. Now, I understand all the three of you are strongly in favor of markets. No one wants to do away with markets. And thirdly, once you know what a human being is and how you should structure human relationships, you have a narrative that tells you how to get there. And you also have a means of saying, the state that we are now in is wrong, is deficient. Something went wrong. At some point, the narrative went astray and took a bad turn. I understand all the three of you say it took a very bad turn indeed. Now let me start with Marcia Pally's proposal. I take it you have an anthropology, philosophical anthropology, that is religiously motivated, that stresses two things. To be a human is in relation, to be in relation with others, and with God possibly, and that means every human being is also different or distinct from the other. So you have a relationship of contrast. This is what I took, relationship and distinctiveness or individuality. And you made the proposal that neither markets nor capitalism is bad. On the contrary, it's good for the strive to become an individual, but we need religious values to tame capitalism or market, as it were. My question is, did I get that right? And how would these values, virtues, really tame the capitalism that we all live in? Yes.
Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, yes and no. When you use the word tame, I understood that you are positing a natural, violent avariciousness that must be tamed by importing some do-good ontology to get our natural Hobbesian war of all against war under control, which I don't agree with. I'm happy to report that most evolutionary biologists today also don't agree with it. It appears, I'll first speak from the evolutionary biologist perspective and then from my own, it appears that we are, in the worlds of Pfaff and other Herdy and other evolutionary biologists, wired for cooperation, for evolutionary survival, from the general principle that those who cooperated more with each other lived longer and got to either teach or, in some sense, pass on the cooperation to the next generation, who then also had more offspring and lived longer. And this is evident both in fields of, for example, hunting and gathering and joining together even with people you don't know to hunt, as well as with child rearing. It appears that parents of both genders who are more cooperative with other parents get more help with their own child rearing, and therefore their offspring survive, and so on. There's an extensive literature from the perspective of evolutionary biology on the survival productivity of cooperation. That seems to be hardwired, and if there are questions, we can talk more about that. And there is also some contemporary research that acts of cooperation not only among people you know, but especially among strangers, somebody on the street who drops their wallet, or somebody who, a total stranger who needs help of someone. In our modern, supposedly anonymous cities, actually triggers cooperative, generous responses in network, not just in chain fashion, A to B, B to C, C to D, but in network fashion, even in our supposed anonymous cities. Very interesting social science research, which I think is catching up to the theology that we have known for 3,000 years, at least in the Abrahamic traditions, and possibly longer in other traditions, that there is a setup. The world is not a random place. Certain things go and certain things don't. For example, we are carbon-based. We are in 3, not 7 dimensions. We are vulnerable to electromagnetic fields. Gravity pulls down, not up. And we are of a common humanness. We are carbon-based, 3-dimensional, and yet we are distinct. That the principle of our commonness and our relationality and our distinction together seems to be the way we are. We are all differentiated from each other. We all have individual fingerprints and so on. And yet there are certain commonalities. So that distinction amid relation is not a Johnny-come-lately idea that somebody thought up to control basic aggressive, violent avariciousness, but in fact is the setup. Under certain conditions, we can violate that setup, and we have multiple examples from the Bible, Confucianism, the Confucianist analects, and modern economy and sociology, that if you violate that setup, you end up with outcomes that are less productive than if you nurture or go with the ontological grain of the fact that nobody gets to be alive without being in relation, without, from our earliest caretakers on, nobody gets to be whoever it is you distinctly are without multiple complex relations, and yet we are distinct. That distinction in relation does seem to be the ontological setup.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm also glad that I got it right, that you think there is an ontological setup that is based on religious values, but now also based on modern science. Now, there are 2 things how you can go about an ontological setup. You can argue for it, or you can believe in it. Religious people usually believe in it. They have faith. That is a word that you used, and faith would not be faith if it were rational, totally rational. You spoke about a hidden theology in our ways we see markets, a faith in the markets. Now it seems to me that we would have good reason to think that this faith was shattered. Yet religious faith is not so easily shattered. My question to you is our way of thinking about the markets and the invisible hand especially a religious faith to your mind? And if it were to be shattered, what would it take?
Well, I think, I mean, once again, I'm no philosopher, and I come at these things from other directions. And it seems to me that one of the things that faith does is it positions you in the world. It allows you to make sense of things, and it allows you to decide how you believe that the world around you is organized and should be organized. So, you know, hence the example of the heavenly spheres and providence and so forth. It's not about, it's about how this ancient philosopher saw his place in the world. I'm not convinced that faith in markets is shattered, particularly. Certainly, I think there's a kind of fanaticism about the economics profession, that although in the more interesting parts of academic economics is starting to loosen up, and there are much more reflective or interesting economists writing and thinking right now, one of them sitting next to me. But there's still some very, very hard-held preconceptions about how we see the world, how we understand it, how we organize data, so forth. Hence, Piketty, for example, and his enormous success. Piketty does nothing spectacular in terms of his methodology or his understanding of how the world works. All he's said is actually the outcomes are not nearly as good as we would have liked. That's why he's caused such a stir, because he's actually a really orthodox economist. So I don't see that. And also I've just I don't know how many people in the audience follow British politics, but a few weeks ago we saw the Conservative government re-elected not by a landslide majority, but certainly by a majority, and that seems to me a vindication of a very particular way of understanding how the world should be organized, or how the polity of Britain should be organized, and how people see their place in it. So one of the characteristics of faith actually is that it's pretty resilient. That would be one of my kind of defining features of it. It's resilient because it's not based on, necessarily on the evidence of the world around us. It's based on lots of other much more complicated underlying factors and self and identity and knowledge and so forth. So I think we still can say that there's a faith in markets, and I think one of the problems is that we don't really know what it would look like to take that away. Hence the argument of, well, okay, what could, if we're stuck with markets, can we play around within that framework? What can we do? How can we take the system down from the inside? As a student politico might say. But there is that sense that we're stuck with this ontological framing.
So there's an ambivalence in faith, we could say. It could be a motor of change. It could also be an obstacle to change if there's too much of it. Christian Felber, there was a shock to the system, and much of your activity as a citizen and in your political movement is caused by that shock, or was enabled by that shock. My question to you is, do you think that on a general level in the population, the faith has been shattered so that people want to change? And the second question is, how important are religious values, or as it were, a religious language game to the kind of movement and change you want to see?
First question, I had no time to give the figures, but there are very serious and reliable opinion polls in many countries. For instance, in Germany by the Bertelsmann Foundation, so who would question their results on critics of capitalism. And in Germany, 88% of the population ask for a different economic order. In Austria, 90% of the population. A different opinion poll by a scientific institution in Berlin figures out that almost 70% of the population would support that the overarching goal of the economy shall become life quality, common good, and happiness. And only 14% of German population support that more GDP growth would lead to more life quality. So I again think the population this faith is already sufficiently shattered in the population, but not in the political elites. I think we have a problem of democracy and of decision making. And to your second question, a little bit continuing with what just Mr. Roscoe has said, I think ideological beliefs are even the strongest obstacle of all. The strongest obstacle of all. I think religious faith can be very helpful if we don't mix them up with an enlightened, democratic, ethical, political debate, but ideological beliefs that we don't even are aware of, and this is the case of the economic debate. They are the strongest obstacle of all for change, because people are not aware that they have a normative position, as Thomas told us yesterday, and this belief is so strong that they don't even search for scientific proof of their normative assumptions and demands. And I made one example with competition. So my approach is, I have a normative approach. I say that I would prefer to organize markets in a cooperative way. But I'm fully aware this is only my subjective normative position, and I fully respect anyone other's different position who proposes that we should markets organize according to the principle of competition. If this person is reflecting herself or himself and aware that this is also only a normative position, then it would be much more easier to look at the empiric evidence. And I gave you the empiric evidence. 87% of studies show that cooperation motivates us stronger than competition. And in the meaning of reflected and conscious value creation, I think that religions are doing an extremely helpful service to human societies, as long as they don't argue this shall be like this because God wants this to be so, but arguing our conviction is that cooperation is a positive value for society, and that's why we defend it. And I would very much support the differentiations on the impact of religions to society of Marcia Pally. With one example, I do not know one single religious system or school on earth that encourages us competition is a wrong word, because it means to search together. But what is happening is that economic actors search against each other for their self-interest, and this would be counterpetition. And there is no single religion that encourages us to practice counterpetition, and all religious systems I know, maybe you know another one, encourage us to practice cooperation and solidarity.
That would be a straight question for Marcia Pally. I don't know a religion that claims that more competition is good, but I know a lot of religious movements, for example in the United States, that are politically active as part, for example, of the neoconservative movement, not so strong now, very strong then, that of course say, yes, Christianity and capitalism is one package, and we strongly favor the politics that open up the markets, that deregulate, that the entire neoconservative movement propagates. And there seems to be a political impact of religious beliefs that seems to be, concerning the ideals that you all three hold, very counterproductive, and it's puzzling to the European mind. I ask this because you also wrote a book about the new evangelicals in the US, and as we have, of course, now a new campaign coming up, is there a change? Do you see a change in the direction that Christian Felber is talking about in that way?
There are quite a number of points here.
Yes.
I've written down a few of them, and I'm just going to tick them off one by one. The first, I want to caution against a slide from literalism or literalist or fundamentalist religions and religion per se. This is an illegitimate slide. You can always pick the one school of thought you don't like and then tar the whole shebang with that. That's illegitimate. It is, as I mentioned in my speech, it is the Enlightenment, democracy, critical thinking, self-reflexivity, debate are not the properties of the Enlightenment against religion, but are in fact religious tenets. And again, I'll repeat, it is a theological idea of the Abrahamic religions that any idea that we hold is at best partial, and other people hold also partial ideas, and it is only by the engagement of those ideas with each other that we have a crack at the way things are. Otherwise, you are in the world of self-deification and idolatry. So I don't see religious thinking, modes of thought, the way theologians go about thinking, and Enlightenment democracy as bifurcated and polarized, but actually the Enlightenment as a piece of those theological thinkings. The second point was also to point out that that science also has beliefs and assumptions, as our speaker last night indicated, but as we know from philosophy of science for the last 100 years, from Polanyi and from Thomas Kuhn and Niels Bohr, all of who talked about the articles of faith, that the sciences rest on, the assumptions they go on, the categories that they have, the questions that it occurs to science to ask, and not other questions, that free will and fallenness. There is no mode of thinking that I know that for 3,000 years, and that's only the Abrahamic religions, not to mention the East Asian religions, that have been contemplating and working through the meaning of human limitation as a role in the human condition and the way we behave with each other. And some of the most rigorous thought I know about the fallenness and of human beings comes from theological discourses. So again, it's not that religion has faith, but science or philosophy is self-reflective and asks your question. It's that theology has been dealing with free will and fallenness for a very long time. To your particular question, I did do about 7 years of field research in the United States looking at the changes in activism of the evangelical communities in the United States, known mostly in Europe for being Yahoo primitives, all believing in the prosperity gospel. And this is unfortunately not a complete, it's fortunately that it is not an accurate and complete picture. My field work was on evangelicals whose activism, that means what they do with their time and their money, would be, I think, what we would here consider progressive. Poverty relief, immigration reform, peace, inclusion and negotiation, and Umweltschutz, environmental protection, would be the 4 areas of activism at the top of the evangelical list. And the English title for this book is The New Evangelicals, echoing Christian Felber's own work, Expanding the Vision for the Common Good. That is the umbrella title of the activism that I found. Of course, not to be naive, the religious right remains as the economic right remains, as the political right remains in the United States and in Europe. but they also are many evangelicals, to close, whose activism follows what we would consider a progressive platform.
Thank you. You spoke of the blind spots of every scientific paradigm method. Certainly there are a lot of blind spots concerning economy. And you spoke about growth and the many shapes that growth comes. We want some things to grow, our children, others we don't want to grow, like cancer cells. So it's a very, very broad concept. But there's also a difference to be made, I think, that is important for all three of you between quantitative and qualitative growth, so to speak. Now, it seems to me one of the big problems when it comes to economy that it's so much easier to measure quantitative growth in contrast to quantitative growth, that the data there is so overwhelming that it creates the impression that this is really what we should look after, because we have not that good methods for measuring qualitative growth right now. Is that true, or is that a misconception?
Right. I think there are some issues around that that need unpacking, and maybe I can start with an example from the UK. We had in, maybe a couple of years ago now, a very bad scandal in the NHS, in the North Staffordshire Trust. I don't know if anyone knows about this, but the NHS regions had been given some devolved power, and they were being encouraged to become trusts, which involved, among other things, building up a bit of a war chest of funds, and it therefore pushed through a whole different way of measuring and counting, and you know, inevitably, I would say, patient care completely deteriorated, and there was, you know, terrible things happened and people died unnecessarily, and there was a big scandal. And the result of the big scandal is a lengthy report that blames a failure of culture in the institution and suggests what we need is a cultural barometer, i.e. another measure for culture. And I think this example absolutely exemplifies our fixation with measuring in the first place. We've got a whole load of problems because we're measuring, so what we need is another measure to measure something that's really quite you know, unspecified, which is then actually going to produce a whole raft of sort of sub-measures. And then the job of any administrator presented by measures is ticking boxes and satisfying the measures. And my colleague, who's an expert in healthcare, said, no, look, actually what we need is, we need space. You know, we need to give professionals working in the area, we need to get out of their way, because they're expert. You know, they have professionalized standards of care hammered into them. There's an ethos of being a surgeon, a doctor, whatever, hammered into you from the first day you walk into medical school, and you need to be given space to deploy that, to do that. So what often isn't recognized, and actually I think it's even not being recognized in the debate we're having now, is that the measures themselves have effects, have consequences. The measures themselves change the world. The way we decide to measure things produces effects. I can give you lots of examples. You know, economic students are more selfish than other students, or particular incentives in firms produce particular kind of employees or whatever. But the fact remains that we seem to be stuck in a discourse of measuring stuff. And then it produces a question like, well, is it easier or harder to measure quantitative or qualitative? Which is really the wrong question. What we need is to find some kind of political space for other forms of conversation. I mean, I won't go any further than that. Marcia has given us a great insight into what those forms of conversation might look like. What I can say is that those forms of conversation can never happen while we're fixated on measuring stuff.
Christian Felber.
I agree that the decisive question is not quantitative or qualitative, because what today appears to us as quantitative was originally qualitative as well. First, we use exchange values, monetary measure, for use values originally. But we managed to translate the use value in an exchange value, which is easier to measure, but we ended up mixing up the measurement with the proper value, which is the use value. That's the problem. At the moment of success measurement, we ought to go back to the use values. On the level of the national economy, that's the satisfaction of needs, that's all aspects of life quality, that's our fundamental values and common goals. And we ought to quantify them, but in a different, of course not in monetary terms. Our proposal, what we've done so far, is in just points, in common good points, or life quality points, or good life points. And what you said about
I'm jumping up and down here, but this is exactly this is what happens when a sociologist and an economist speak, because the economists can never get outside of this, how did you describe it, nominalist view, the sense that there's the world, there's the world, I'm here, and I have some tools and I can measure, and these things are entirely unconnected.
And this is exactly the way they keep mixing up tools and goals. And the goals of the economy have always be decided by all people, all citizens, because the economy is not a goal in itself. It is an instrument at the service of the whole society. So I strongly back all those who say that the economy must not be left in the hands only exclusive of economists, but be shaped or intelligently designed by all citizens. I'm not an economist, and I take care of the reshape of the economy because I cannot accept that only economists shape the economy. So the concrete proposal, much in line with what you just said about local assemblies, our proposal is that the sovereign body, which is all citizens, gather in their towns, villages, and debate and decide on the most fundamental cornerstones of the economic order.
Okay. I was asking the question of quantitative, qualitative, because exactly that is what is happening right now in Germany. We have, by Chancellor Merkel and her government, and that's the question for you, 250 events, I think, all over the country, where people from the government come, and they are communities, they speak out what the good life should be. And my question is that a kind of kidnapping the issue, or is it an honest human effort?
It's a clear case of kidnapping, and we even suppose we don't know if they kidnapped this from us, because it's in the book since 2010.
Yes.
And now they started with it, so 3 years later, maybe they became aware that it's a good idea, and they do as if. And the as if is that people are asked, but then it has no effect. So it's eine Verarschung, how do you say it?
We leave it that, we leave it in the German term, I think.
It's not taking serious the sovereign will, and what we propose is a true democracy, a sovereign democracy. I studied political science, by the way, and I learned that sovereignty is the core principle of democracy, but no one ever explained to me what it means literally, and I looked it up in the Latin dictionary, and it says, to stand above all. And 10 years after my studies, I started to think on this core principle of democracy, what could it mean literally if the people stood above all? And my today answer is that the people write the constitution. And the constitution regulates the power of our representatives, meaning the parliament and the government. And the constitution gives the guidelines of all policy fields on 2 or 3 pages only, because it's only the fundamental cornerstones. And then our beloved representatives still are the lawmakers, first and foremost, but they have to obey the constitution and fulfill its spirit and its guidelines given by the sovereign citizens. And that could happen in those decentralized assemblies, and that would be, from the procedure, a totally different approach than that of Mother Merkel.
Okay, clear words. All the 3 of you spoke about the need to reorganize markets, to find a different, more intelligent ways to give them a shape, to reshape the processes. And I guess all of you agree with the values that Marcia Pally laid out, that it should be reciprocal, and it should be a giving and taking that is non-exploitative. I would rephrase it that way. What are the most efficient ways of doing so that make you most hopeful it is possible, and what are the main challenges? And maybe from Marcia Pally, do you think, you never made a clear distinction between religion and theology, and I won't make it either, but what is the role of institutionalized religion when it comes to bring about these effects?
I have to be honest and say that I don't have a prescription at my fingertips, and I'm not sure even that most efficient is the way we should be thinking about this, because in a sense efficiency is the central market virtue, and it for me it seems to be one of the problems with our sort of polity at the moment seems to be a fixation with efficiency that translates into cost benefits and so forth. So I would hope that we could make space for discussion, that we could make space for risk and innovation and curiosity and all of those kind of things. I'm going to have to leave it to more innovative people than me, but the example of the local scheme I think is a nice one because it's local and specific and fit for purpose, and my suspicion is that it will be other such kind of local, functional, fit for purpose type schemes, or alternatively maybe perhaps the other set of tools we have at our disposal are the very sophisticated tools that economists can deploy for distributing goods, algorithmic processes and so forth, so long as we have already decided what the rules of distribution should be. So when I see the windmills fluttering over the countryside around where I live, and I think of the complexities involved in making that kind of power grid work, then this is a clear place where we need sophisticated economic tool making. So the answer is specific, fit for purpose, and in particular places. And because of that, I don't have a grand prescription to give you.
You asked me about the role. Try that again.
Yes.
You asked me about the role of institutionalized religions, as though some feel-good amorphous spirituality were positive and institutionalized religions were the bane of all evil and responsible for every bad thing that has ever happened in the world. I don't think there's such a bifurcation, and I'm joking with you if you didn't really mean that. Because it is in the purview of both private thinking and institutions, schools, churches, mosques, synagogues, and so on, that the theological thinking that I've been discussing this morning has occurred in debate with people who disagree. Even theologians, as you know, within a single faith tradition, disagree and argue and write conflicting books and disagree with their forefathers and foremothers and write books that disagree with them. And this has been going on for millennia within institutionalized religions in a very, very productive way. So in the same way that an individual can look at distinction amid relation and our relationality, which is both the relation of distinct persons, so do institutionalized religions. And the book that I'm finishing now is on this theology of relationality, on the theology of distinction amid relation. And as I'm not a theologian, I learned and studied this through reading theologies in the Abrahamic traditions. So I didn't come to distinction amid relation or relationality or ask why the other side is for the other side by reading, economics. I came to it by reading theology. And at the end of my talk, and I'll just sum it up again, I learned it by reading about covenant, by reading about being in the image of God, Tselem Elohim, or Imago Dei, about our moral correspondence, about the relationality of Trinity and Eucharist, and most of all about gift and grace. We don't live in this world on our self-sufficient own. We live from what we are given to by others.
So there are many ways to the truth. What would be your take on the things that make you most hopeful and the methods that are most efficient in reshaping the markets?
Well, I just can report on a concrete instrument that we have already developed and is being implemented by almost 300 companies in 10 countries, although the movement for an economy for the common good is very young. It's less than 5 years into existence. And the instrument is the already mentioned common good balance sheet. So if we expect or wish companies to behave in a virtuous way, if we share these values that are in our constitutions, then why don't we ask companies to which degree they live and fulfill with these values? And the Common Good Balance Sheet asks companies to which degree they live the 5 most frequent constitutional values: human dignity, social justice, ecological sustainability, solidarity, and democracy. In a democratic process, there can be added one or changed another. But this is a first draft proposal from our movement as a gift to society. And the score is measurable and comparable in points. That's very important, because then you can, in the future, you can reward ethical performance, ethical achievement, which is necessary, because the more ethical a company today behaves, the more expensive become their products and services. This is the anti-ethical effect of capitalistic markets, and we would try to invert this relationship so that ethical products and services became more economic to end consumers, thanks to the linkage of the Common Good Balance Sheet result to differentiated measures of market incentives, like differentiated tax rates, differentiated tariffs, differentiated loan conditions, or priority in public procurement. So far, 250 companies, up to 2,000 employees have done it. There's a research project financed by the Ministry for Education and Research in Berlin with 3 stock market companies from the Frankfurt Stock Market Index. And next week we will present the initiative to the European Economic and Social Committee, which has by itself taken the initiative to formulate a petition for an ethical common market instead of a free common market, and for an ethical external trade strategy as an alternative to the TTIP and the uglily euphemistic free trade agreements.
I certainly hope that won't be kidnapped too in the wrong way. We have time for 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Please, is there the person with the micro? Otherwise, I will do it. Ah, there it is. Dirk Pils will do it. So, questions, please.
Could you list the 5 criteria again? Human dignity,
solidarity, justice, sustainability, and democracy. And if you miss freedom, then this is because the balance sheet is implemented by a free and with no problem private company.
It's performative in there.
Right. Implicit.
Thank you. I have one question that's been sort of going through my mind during the whole presentations, and that is, when we do agree, and it was very logical to agree, that cooperation is the most effective and most productive way of conducting economic activity and not competition, the question does arise then, how do I combat the issue of dominance in the market, which is always a cause of suppressing those who want to enter the market and to be successful. I mean, yesterday with the example of Microsoft is sort of an example of, culturally, of a bad company, but the power of Microsoft is based on cooperation with Intel and with hardware producers. So actually Microsoft is based on cooperation, and that's sort of the problem, because the power of Microsoft suppresses others.
Yes.
Yes, of course you can use cooperation at the cost of third parties, but that's not what we propose. in the present system, it's logical that cooperation serves the present goal. And the present goal is to maximize one's financial profits or one's self-interest. And thanks to this setting of the markets, cooperation is an instrument at the cost of third parties. In the alternative that we propose, the goal is a different one. The goal is the common good. And if you use cooperation as an instrument to increase the common good, then you cannot, by definition, use it as at the cost of third parties. Of course, this is just the ideal picture. Now, how concretely would we prevent it? 3 very concrete prevention mechanisms. First, a top size for companies with a progressive transition. The bigger they become, the more they have to share both voting rights and property, so they can decide freely if they want to be fully privately owned, but then they have to remain comparatively small, or if they want to grow, but then they have to share power. Second, antitrust laws would not only still exist, but be strengthened, because it's a truly liberal market economy approach, in the meaning that all citizens and companies would enjoy the same rights and the same liberties and the same opportunities, which at the present is not the case, which I can speak out of experience because we are founding a bank. Against Bertolt Brecht, who said that worse than robbing a bank is founding one. For the first time in my life, I contradict him. And that's why I need an antitrust regulation, that smaller ones can also enter the place. And yeah, but the most important point I already mentioned before, any behavior against third parties would worsen your common goods balance sheet result, and as a consequence, provide you higher taxes, higher tariffs, and a series of disadvantages. So you still can do it, you're free to do it, but you will have negative consequences.
Someone else want to answer? Yes.
Just a small note, which is to remind ourselves of something we may often forget when we suddenly talk about economics, that economic actors, like everybody else, exist in what Bourdieu called habitus, or discourse. You live in cultures, and what motivates behavior is people's habitus or worldviews, or what they think goes down, the way they think the world is. And these change very slowly, as every historian and sociologist knows, but they do change. And when I talked a little bit in my remarks about the early modern era, that took centuries to happen, but it was evidence of a change from one general ontology to the ontology emerging from rationalism and nominalism and science in the early modern era. Ours is not static, and this ours is also changing. And it has to, and so the question is, in what direction? And this would apply to those in power as well, political power as well as economic power. What is the worldview, knowledge system that people assume or automatically believe is the case? And that would be for Microsoft as well. And that's why in my example, when I talked about our little logging firm example and asking why the other side is for the other side, and the negotiation that would come from that, yeah, that happens when it doesn't occur to anybody to do anything else, because the entire the knowledge system is that that's what we do. We ask why the other side is for the other side, and we ask why all people who are engaged to contribute, and nobody leaves until the solution is arrived at that abandons nobody's needs and goals. That's not the current worldview. We are still sort of coming out of early modernity, its science and its nominalism, but we are capable of change, and that would apply to your power brokers.
Okay, opening up paths and ways for new possibilities, ways to think and act. That's certainly the purpose of this conference, of this podium. It certainly happened to me, so I thank you for that. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Marcia Pally, Philip Roscoe, Christian Felber,
live long and prosper, and I hope you have a good conference. Thank you.
And thank you.